What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 77 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where two best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Peter Messi, joined as always by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Stephen Radford.
Hello.
Hello, Steve. We got a big one today. Your home nation of the United Kingdom making headlines as the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, is again making a stink about Microsoft's attempts to acquire one Activision Blizzard. Big news day today, Steve. How you feeling?
Well, some of us love to see it. Some of us don't. Because I know you predicted that the deal was successfully going to close this year, and I said it wouldn't. So we'll see. We'll see who wins.
I know it's very interesting. Just the bets aside, it's a big story. But us being on opposite ends of thinking how it's going to play out, I think it's going to make this an interesting conversation. So let's jump right into it. We've got a bit to get into today. So the Reader's Digest here, right? Well, I'll give you the headline and then we'll jump into the story as we have the conversation. The CMA has essentially said that they have very big concerns that Microsoft's acquisition is going to basically be a problem for UK gamers, that it's going to impact competition negatively, specifically through exclusives and in the cloud space. Those were kind of the two big areas that they highlighted as their big concerns. And they have made a couple of suggestions about how Microsoft can proceed if they'd like to get approval from the CMA to finalize the deal. So that includes a few different suggested remedies. One of them is what's known as a partial divestiture of Activision Blizzard, which would mean selling off some of the aspects of the business. So like one of the things they said was if they sell Call of Duty off, they would approve the deal. If they were willing to sell off the entirety.
Who can they sell Call of Duty to? Because I'm sure Sony would happily snap that up from them.
Yeah, probably. I mean, right?
Doesn't that then negate?
Isn't that the same problem
issue that they have? That's the exact same problem. So who buys that? It would have to be an independent. And I don't know who can afford to buy Call of Duty as a franchise, because that's one of the reasons that they wanted.
I mean,
they wanted them.
I think the companies that could do it are a pretty short list. If you're talking about it can't be a platform holder, right? If it can't be Sony,
it'd have to be like EA or Ubisoft at this point, or I maybe Embracer Group.
I was gonna say I think it'd be Tencent or the Embracer Group. That's what I would guess.
Yeah, and Tencent's one of the. I don't think Tencent is probably gonna end up buying it. I mean, NetEase, I know Activision Blizzard had a deal with NetEase at some point, so maybe they come in and scoop it up. I don't know. I just can't see that one happening. I know that the Microsoft's play on this, and as Phil Spencer's been saying, it's like a mobile play, and that's really why they want to get in here. But you've got to imagine that Call of Duty Mobile is
Call of Duty's part of that, right?
Big reasons, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he can say that all he wants, but I'm sure Call of Duty is a big part of that equation in their mind of Call of Duty Mobile, one of the big mobile games out there, right? Like you said, but also, I mean, it's also a cash cow. And I think even just aside from the fact that the IP is valuable, I think the studios that make it are valuable. The Sledgehammer.
Well, I mean, you'd get the studios, you just wouldn't have the Call of Duty IP by the sounds of it, but
I guess
I don't buy the IP.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess you're probably right. They could probably sell the IP and keep the studios if they wanted to, but these are studios that have been built up to make Call of Duty. Granted, I'm sure some of them they would want to pull off.
But they could chuck them on Halo, because it sounded like 343 got gutted in the last few months.
Yeah, and they are planning on working with third parties to do that. You're not wrong. That could make sense. I guess they could keep Raven and all those studios in the portfolio if they really wanted to. But the other remedies that they've suggested is entirely selling one half of the business. So selling all of Activision is an option. Selling the Blizzard segment is an option. I mean, obviously, none of those are things that Microsoft wants to do. They want the whole kit and caboodle. I think even if you believe what Phil's saying, that the real reason they want it is so they can acquire King, I'm sure that I'm sure they don't want to pass off on owning all these really valuable IP either, because I think it's a no-brainer the ways in which owning both the Activision and Blizzard sides of the equation like are a huge boon for Game Pass, right? Being able to have Call of Duty there day and date, being able to have World of Warcraft and the BattleNet launcher games rolled into PC Game Pass, the same way that they have that partnership with Riot.
And I kind of feel that that's one of the CMA's. I mean, that is one of the CMA's biggest concerns is cloud gaming and game exclusivity. They said that they estimate that Microsoft currently has 60 to 70% of the global cloud gaming services, and the shutdown of Stadia did not do anything to help that. It means that one of the other big players in the industry is gone, and having these exclusive games on their platform that I know Phil Spencer has said will do a cloud version of Call of Duty for PlayStation's platform if they want. You can make those promises, but as Phil said before, it can't just be perpetual. And I highly recommend everyone go listen to the Verge's the Verge's podcast with Nilay Patel. It was a really good interview and really insightful. I think it showed a lot of what he thought and what his thinking was. And I think it is mobile and it is cloud. And gaming exclusivity goes a very long way to sell your platform.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's so interesting about some of these arguments, though, right? Is that it's like, oh, they're going to weaken competition through exclusive games. It's like, well, yeah, right? Like that's always how it's worked. And
yeah, but
it's just now that you're buying one of the biggest companies in the world, like that. Yeah, it could really significantly limit competition, I guess, depending on what Xbox does, right? And to your point, they've offered a 10-year deal with Sony, but what happens when that 10 years is up, right? And then maybe they don't re-sign, and then it's like, okay, now Call of Duty is exclusive. And who knows though, right? That's the thing that I think makes this so interesting, right? Is that it really is so multifaceted, because the idea of will Call of Duty still be as relevant as it is now in 10 years? I don't know, maybe not. It could be, but I think in general, the conversation around shooters is evolving, back, 2 generations ago, the Xbox 360 PS3 era, I think there was an argument to be made that Call of Duty was and continues to be this juggernaut that it is, right? It's I think inarguably the biggest first person shooter brand. But we've had the Fortnites of the world and some of these other kind of different flavors of shooter come up and kind of chip away at that ubiquity, where Call of Duty is still the biggest game in town of its ilk, but that kind of game in general is not nearly as popular as it used to be, right? You think to even just a couple years ago, we were able to support multiple annual big box, full price shooters like that. And I think the market's moving away from it. I think you can look at the struggles that Battlefield has had the last couple years, and it's a clear, at least in my mind, it feels like a clear example of maybe there just isn't room for all of these juggernaut shooters like that anymore. And maybe Call of Duty is able to maintain relevance 10 years from now and it never goes away. But I think there was a time where you would think that about Halo, and look at it now, not that it's irrelevant, but it's not a juggernaut the way that it was. So I don't know, it's funny because like you said, it certainly isn't permanent. And this is the thing we talk about all the time with these acquisitions, right? Generally speaking, I think Phil Spencer has been a good leader at Xbox, and I think he's done a good job of bringing studios into the fold and giving them the resources they need, and turning out.
Some extent, yeah, but look at 343. That was just a disaster.
Sure, and I was going to say, right, is what happens when the market changes? What happens when Phil steps down and someone else takes his place, right? Once these decisions are made, they are permanent, and I think there's good reason to be cautious when it comes to just allowing this continued media consolidation, because you don't want to get to a point where video games are like the film industry, and there's about 3 games in town, and 9 of the 12 blockbusters that come out are made by Disney. It's like, we don't want that. We don't want these megalithic
Yeah.
corporations ruling the games industry. That's not positive for anybody. But I think there is a legitimate question to ask, like, how much does this actually matter? Because I think it would certainly impact people's willingness to buy an Xbox. I think it might challenge certain players' loyalty to PlayStation, but is that?
Yeah, but will it? Because you've got that deal for 10 years, and I know the CMA has said that they don't feel that those behavioral remedies, which is what they've called them, are enough.
They have said
And
that
the
they're
CMA
open
said,
to them, though. Like, that's the door isn't totally closed on that. We'll put a pin in that and
yeah,
talk about it in a minute. But please finish your point.
but the CMA said behavioral remedies are less likely to have an effective impact, which is what they were talking about, having agreements for Call of Duty and other Activision games to be on like PlayStation and Nintendo Switch, because obviously they've made that commitment with Nintendo and bringing that to bringing Call of Duty to their next platform. I just don't know that they're going to see that as enough. And obviously they've suggested, well, sell Call of Duty and you can kind of have it. And I don't know that Microsoft will want that and will agree to that in any way, because that's a huge change and a huge shift in the deal.
I wonder what they would decide. Like, if, because I don't think they'll just be like, okay, forget it, we won't buy any of it. They've already spent money, and like, if what Phil's saying is true and King is the thing they really care about, then it's like, all right, do you maybe
ban off Call of Duty or do you ban off Blizzard?
I wonder. And maybe Blizzard makes more sense,
I don't know if it does though, because you've got Diablo 4 and World of Warcraft. Overwatch 2 is just bringing in like a shitload of cash from the reports that we saw this week. Why would you get rid of that? You've got a free to play shooter there with Overwatch. I think you can kind of revive that and revitalize it.
Yeah, maybe.
Hearthstone gives you a mobile play. You've got a mobile team there that you can utilize.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Activision.
I didn't think about Hearthstone as a part of the equation there.
So it's tough because, like, yeah, you lose Call of Duty Mobile and you lose the Call of Duty franchise, but that's one franchise versus an entire company.
Yeah, and it's like the rest of the stuff that Activision owns is not as valuable. Some of it is. Like, I think Xbox owning like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, like, those would be big wins for them. They don't have a lot of family friendly stuff. They don't have a big mascot platforming, brand or anything like that. And granted,
I mean, I don't necessarily
I guess,
feel like PlayStation does. I don't feel like PlayStation does these days. Not really.
Not
like,
really.
They've got Astro, but not in the same way. Like, we haven't had a full Astro game
They have
for
Ratchet
a while.
and Clank, though.
Yeah,
which is an all ages thing. And again,
I just
right?
don't feel like that's a mascot. I feel like we've moved away from those like mascot, other than Nintendo, which is seen as like the family brand.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
PlayStation's mascot is like arguably Kratos at this point.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely more like adult characters are the face of PlayStation. But that's the thing, is I think that could be valuable for Xbox. That could be a differentiator in the market, right? Of like, oh, yeah, maybe you already own a Nintendo Switch for the kids or whatever, but maybe, cause I'm just imagining, right, like that casual use case, I think of like my cousin's family where like dad is a gamer, but he's casual, he plays Call of Duty, he maybe plays, a FIFA or something like that, but like he's not a huge gamer, but enough that like having an Xbox in the house makes sense, right? Okay, then maybe like there's teenagers in the house, and then there's little kids, and it's like, okay, like, wouldn't you want to be able to be like, Xbox is
one platform,
and like with Game Pass, right? With, you don't even need to buy games. You could buy an Xbox Series S and a Game Pass subscription, and for under $400,
I think the ultimate goal is that you don't need to buy anything. You buy a controller and you connect it to your Samsung TV or whatever the stick they're going to be developing.
Yeah,
and
great point.
And you connect it straight to their streaming service, which is ultimately what their goal is. And I think that's where the concern comes in. Is I think the CMA aren't looking necessarily at the current market and where it is, which is very much console centric. It's where it's going to go in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think in the next 10 years, cloud streaming possibly is gonna ramp up and become the place to be, and it's obviously where the competition's heating up. We've seen Sony come into it with their latest offerings with PlayStation Plus,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that Google dropped out, but they're not the only ones in town. And
You got
I
Amazon
think
too still with
yeah,
Luna.
you've got Amazon. I think you're probably going to see other people kind of coming into it in the same way that we had Netflix, and then all of these other streaming services popped up around it. I think we had Game Pass, and it was the place that all of these games were for a while. And then eventually, I think the publishers are going to branch out and do their own. We've already seen that with EA Play and Ubisoft Plus. I think Embracer is like ripe to make their own at some point. Same with like Devolver. I'm surprised they haven't because Humble's got their own thing. It's like at some point I kind of feel like Game Pass isn't going to be the place to go, and I think that's why Microsoft can kind of see the writing on the wall there and want to snap up all of these games and all these
Yeah.
IPs, so they've got stuff to bolster up their library that's owned by them, and they don't have to worry about stuff leaving the platform and coming to the platform all the time. It's just like, well, we own Call of Duty, so it can be on
They
there,
own enough
and it's there
to support
forever.
the platform on its own
Yeah.
merit, right? Yeah. That's the thing, though. I think that's probably the point the CMA has that's the strongest against this acquisition is I really genuinely wonder what the future of game streaming is, because I agree with you that I think it's probably going to increase in relevance as time goes on, right? And as like the technology becomes more affordable and as Microsoft continues to invest and everything. I got to be honest with you. I don't see a universe where anyone is a legit competitor to them, because
No,
they,
not right now, because Google dropped out and they were the only ones that had the servers and architecture. I could see
yeah.
Amazon doing it. They just really have to commit, and they really need to sort their branding out.
And like,
Like, ditch Luna and go with Twitch. Like, Twitch is your
sure.
gaming brand. Come up with a Twitch game
Yeah.
streaming service. Have it automatically connect to it so you can stream from your streaming service to Twitch and live stream it. All you got to do is hook a camera up, and you're there and you're going. That was like one of the big things with Stadia, or at least it was meant to be. I don't know if it ever
Yeah.
came
That
out,
never
which
happened.
was you streamed straight to YouTube from it, and it was like we're
Or you
all
could be watching
integrated
something
into
on
all of our
YouTube and
different
click a
platforms.
Stadia button and get
And
and go
click it,
buy
and it goes straight in. Yeah,
Yeah.
you could do the exact same thing. They could do the exact same thing with Twitch. There's no reason not to. And they own AWS, which is the kind of de facto standard in terms of like server software and
Right.
architecture.
And that's the thing is, I think you've identified them. They're the only legitimate option, because anybody else, right? Like even PlayStation's competitor is based on Microsoft's technology.
Yeah, they've got the agreement with Microsoft. I think it's running on Azure.
Yeah, right.
So it's those games are probably running on Xboxes, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
You would think so, right? So I mean, that's the thing is, like I think as it stands, Microsoft has a stranglehold on that side of the industry, and Amazon could be a competitor, but is Amazon going to be willing to invest the amount of money that Microsoft has in gaming? I don't think so. I don't think Amazon is going to spend $80 billion, right? Between this and all of the smaller studios they've snapped up and the Bethesda acquisition, right? Like you're coming up on, because what, this one was 67 billion, right? Was for Activision Blizzard, and Bethesda was like what, like 6 or something like that.
I could see them doing it. Like they do spend money for acquisitions. It's never been anywhere near that. I think their biggest like multimedia acquisition was the James Bond studio MGM, and snapping that up.
Yeah.
But that was again entirely for the IP. I don't know how much they spent for because they bought the Lord of the Rings company as well, didn't they? Middle Earth, I think.
Did they though?
So they do.
Because like
do
Embracer's
buy a
involved
lot.
in that too. Like it's such a, I don't know where the rights fell on that.
Yeah, it's maybe Embracer bought it.
Because
I don't
Embracer
know.
like bought the rights to the Lord of the Rings in media, so I don't know how that worked out with Rings of Power, which is the Amazon show, and what the deal is there. But
it could just be it could just be a partnership, or maybe they just bought the
they
TV
licensed
rights
it out
for
or whatever, right? But yeah, I mean you're right. Like they could, right? They have resources. They could start acquiring big companies and really like making a play, but I just don't know that they will, because I think for them to really truly compete, they need to double down and be like, video games are a serious part of our business moving forward. right? And that like we're
I
going
don't
to invest.
understand why they haven't, because they own Twitch, and it makes no sense to me. They should be able to see the number of people watching on Twitch and streaming on Twitch, and is just growing and growing and growing, and kind of capitalizing on that. And like, I just don't understand why they haven't.
Yeah, you would think, right? But I don't know. It's not to say that they won't, but I think a lot of these big companies, like they get gun shy. They enter gaming because they're like, oh, Fortnite's making $1 billion a month, and blah blah. Like, and they smell the blood in the water, and then they get in there and they realize, oh, geez, it's a lot of work to maintain a video game studio. It's a big risk to invest in making a AAA game for 5 or 6 years and then have it come out and be a flop, and whatever. You look at how many projects they've canceled versus how many projects they've actually finished, and it's
Yeah.
it's not a lot. We've seen them invest in bringing talent in and stuff like that. And I don't know. It's like, we'll see, right? Like 5 years from now, I think the question is going to be is in 5 years, right? Is Amazon a pillar in the video game industry the way that Xbox, PlayStation, whomever is, or have they gone the route of Google where they're like, this is more trouble than it's worth and we're going to just bail? Because
Yeah, they could easily sell off Twitch, or just spin it out as its own separate company
or
at
just
some
leave
point.
it, right? Because like that's the thing is I like Twitch is related to gaming, but I also don't think Twitch is like a gaming brand necessarily, right? Like, yes, the primary thing people do on Twitch is watch people stream video games, but there's also talk shows, there's Twitch Creative, there's I think owning the de facto place people watch live content on the internet, or one of the de facto places, has value beyond being like, we want to be involved in video games, right? Like, I think selling ad space on Twitch is a much different business than maintaining multiple AAA studios where you have thousands of employees working on games for years and, things like that. And again, who knows? Like, maybe they just lean into being a publisher and they keep making partnerships like they did with Embracer
Yeah, you
Group.
can do that.
Like,
Well, they've
that's
got Amazon's also got the partnership with Ubisoft, because I know a bunch of Ubisoft games are on that
on Luna.
Luna
Yeah.
platform. Maybe you just do a partnership with EA as well, and get all the EA Play games over there as well.
You
Do
could.
the partnership with Devolver, get a bunch of indie titles, or Humble. There are ways they can get games on their platform, because that's how Microsoft did it at the beginning with Game Pass. They didn't necessarily have a huge library themselves until they bolstered it out with Bethesda and built up their kind of exclusives again.
And I think we forget like the buying spree they went on before the major acquisitions, right? Like that was their strategy prior, was like, okay, let's buy Double Fine and add all their games to Game Pass. Let's buy
Well, they bought a bunch of studios that were just making games for them. Like, they had Playground Games. They bought 1010 Studios that they bought. They bought Ninja Theory. They bought tons of places.
This is killing me. I can't think of their name. Obsidian. I was like, why can't I think of their name? I was like blanking on that. Anyway, yeah. So I mean,
but Obsidian's games are weird because they were all published by other people, so they don't have the rights. So that none of them are on Game Pass. Like, I think maybe Outer Worlds is.
Outer Worlds is.
So that's the only one. But again, that was published by Private Division, so they
own the
had
IP.
to make a deal, crack a deal there. But Pillars of Eternity is nowhere to be seen.
Right.
That's not there
yet. Right? Who knows? I wouldn't be surprised if Xbox starts doing that at some point, being like, we'll buy that IP back. We'll buy that IP back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Like, I think that's the biggest argument here. I think the exclusivity thing is like not as big a deal, honestly.
Well, yeah, that's the other big argument, right? Is that they said the CMA provisionally found that weakening competition by restricting access that other platforms have to Activision's games could substantially reduce the competition between Xbox and PlayStation in the UK, in turn harming UK gamers. And I just don't get that. PlayStation is miles ahead of Xbox.
Yeah, that's a really straw man argument. The idea that like, oh, it's gonna like, and that it harms UK gamers by being like, oh, you might have to buy another console. It's like, come on, like, I don't know about all that. Like, PlayStation is such a clear market leader in the UK, and they have been since 1995, right? Like, since the PlayStation.
Yeah.
Nintendo like had to fight to get a foothold in that market,
Well, yeah, because they always treated us as like
an afterthought.
Second thought, really.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, the N64 came out like 2 years ago. Here you go, you can finally have it. It's just like,
yeah.
okay, well, guess what? We don't give a shit because we've had the PlayStation for like 3 years.
Right,
So
exactly.
whatever.
And again, right, like Microsoft is Xbox is a clear number 3, period, in every market. You know, they're
Yes.
not number 2 anywhere. And
The only place they're number 1 is in cloud streaming.
right.
That's the only place. And I understand that argument. As we've discussed, but the argument of owning Call of Duty reduces competition. I understand that because it is PlayStation's biggest selling game every single year. It's always at the top of like the best selling list or the most profitable list because they sell a bunch of kind of microtransactions. But I don't think that's an argument. Just because it hurts PlayStation doesn't mean that it reduces competition between the two. I
Yeah.
think that should promote competition. If anything, it should be
Right.
okay. Well, PlayStation needs to strive to replace it, and they kind of already have with Destiny. They bought Bungie.
And that's the kind of my thing is, right? Like, and again, I want to be really clear, right? I'm not in favor of media consolidation. I do not like media consolidation. I think we should be afraid of it, right? I want to be crystal clear about that. I agree with you, though. I don't think this materially changes Xbox's position in such a huge way that because there was and I don't have the percentage in front of me, but I saw a thing where I believe there was a survey that was saying that like 25% of gamers said that they would consider switching to Xbox if Xbox owned Call of Duty or whatever. And it's like, okay, even so, right? If you cut off 25% of the audience of the PS5, it's still the clear market leader above the Xbox.
Yeah, but that like it's just that assumes that they're not going to buy both. And I'd love to know the percentage of people that would choose to buy both because I would imagine, yes, I really want to play Call of Duty, and that in some scenario where it's not available on both platforms, and I just can't see that for any, and at least in the near future. They've offered a 10-year deal. That's a very long time. That takes us far into the next generation.
It would probably take us through most of the next generation, right? Like if you think about it.
Yeah.
You're close
Yeah, I
to
would
halfway
imagine
through
so,
the
yeah.
PS6 generation before it would be a problem.
Yeah. So and at that point, it's just like you should have made provisions and like either renegotiated the deal and known it wasn't going to happen, so you've like kind of made your own competition to it. I don't know. It's an interesting one. I do wonder where it goes. I can understand why the CMA is just like, yeah, that 10-year deal's not good enough, right? Because they could easily just go back on it in 10 years.
Let's talk about that real quick. So, you called this quote out earlier, right? The CMA says, quote, behavioral remedies, are less likely to have an effective impact. And they're more or less trying to rule that route out as being like a legitimate option. But they said, unless the regulator is, quote, confident that the remedy was capable of effective implementation, monitoring, and enforcement. And I think that's the thing, right? Like you said, how do you enforce it beyond the initial agreement? And the answer is you can't, right? Like that's just not a thing that...
No, and you can't force two private companies to have just a perpetual
agreement.
Like, it's going to go on forever. Like you get Call of Duty until the end of time because it just doesn't work.
And Microsoft has responded to those claims, and that's still the path they want to go, obviously, right? Because as we said, they want the whole thing, right? They want all the arms of the business because each of them gives them an advantage that they need, you know? They've been trying to bolster PC Game Pass. Blizzard will obviously be a big boon to that. Obviously, Call of Duty is valuable. Obviously, King is a big play in the mobile space. So this is from Microsoft's Rima Aleli, is I believe how you say the name. Apologies if not Rima. This is the Microsoft's CVP and Deputy General Counsel for the case. And they said, we are committed to offering effective and easily enforceable solutions that address the CMA's concerns. Our commitment to grant long-term 100% equal access of Call of Duty to Sony, Nintendo, Steam, and others preserves the deal's benefits to gamers and developers and increases competition in the market. And that's the thing.
Yeah, which is a standard thing, right? They said that this is exactly what they've said before.
Mm-hmm. But that's the thing, is I think you make a compelling argument that I actually think this would increase competition in the market, at least when it comes to hardware, right? It would make Xbox a more legitimate competitor to PlayStation and Nintendo to a lesser degree. But that's the thing, right? Is you have to look at it not in the imminence in what does this mean 10 years from now, 20 years
is in 10 years time, is cloud going to be how the majority of people play it, and our console's going to be an enthusiast device. That's like a distinct possibility, because the majority of people already play video games on their mobile. Are they going to continue that trend and play
I don't think
larger
so.
games through cloud streaming?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think we're a ways off from that, but you don't know, right? Like it's impossible to say, and any amount of like saying, well, this could happen. It's just all prognostication. We have no idea where the industry is going to be in 10 years. We have no idea where like our economy is going to be in 10 years. And those things greatly impact the video game industry, right? Again, to take it back to the Xbox 360 PS3 era, which is, I believe, right, the longest generation of consoles by a year or two, maybe even a little longer. And that was because of the global recession that we faced in 2008, and that fact that people did not have more money to buy new consoles, and game development studios could not afford to spend more money making games. So development and advancement in the industry stalled out for a couple of years, and that might happen. We might be heading to that right now, and maybe we're looking at the new longest console generation with these boxes, right? Because it feels like this generation's just started and we're already like 3 years into it,
Yeah, but we spoke about that. I think it was on last week's show, where it felt like that. It felt like that, but we compared it with the PlayStation 4 generation, right? And it was similar.
Yeah.
In terms of when things started heating up.
For sure.
It was in that year 3 range. So I feel like this is when we're really going to start seeing it. We also didn't have a global pandemic and a recession with the last generation, so it could extend the lifetime here. But I do think cloud streaming is gonna have an impact in the future.
I mean, I think it's already having an impact. I think the question is, does it become ubiquitous, right? Because, like, I think, again, that's a big difference. Like, you look at streaming, right? And I would argue that has become the de facto way that people watch things, right? Netflix was an extremely disruptive business model to the way that people, like, DVD sales used to be a key part of how movies made money. That revenue stream is basically non-existent anymore, right? Things like that. I don't know that video games are gonna go in that direction wholly. I think there's a good chance that it becomes a significant percentage, right? And it's because that's how we play, right? Like, you and I are like dedicated multi-platform players.
I feel like that's when it becomes like the enthusiasts buy the video games and they are excited about them and they play them, right? Which is me and you and our listeners.
Yeah.
But the general person who just plays Call of Duty and FIFA, why would I go and spend $500-$600 on a console and then a copy of Call of Duty every year when I could just subscribe when I want to and play Call of Duty on Game Pass and it runs fine?
Play it on your TV?
I've got decent internet at my house and I can just play it on my TV. Yeah, and all I've got to do is buy a controller, which I probably already got anyway from like last generation, and any Bluetooth controller connects.
Right.
Why wouldn't I do that? And it's only going to get better in the next 10 years. We're at like the beginning of it here,
right?
And it's only going to grow from here and out. And the same with internet architecture, with the rollout of 5G, with the rollout of like gigabit.
That's going to be a game changer
to the home. It's really going to be a game changer, and I think the CMAs are looking at that, and that's where the majority of their concerns are. And I think the concerns with the exclusivity makes sense when it comes to cloud streaming platforms, because it only bolsters Microsoft's dominance there, the 60 to 70% they have estimated. I mean, I don't know what they're looking at, but I can't really think of any other cloud streaming service other than Luna that even comes close to it. But I don't know what's going on in China.
Yeah, right. I'm imagining that they're considering Luna, but then also like other like like EA Play and Ubisoft. And
But EA Play doesn't have a streaming component unless it's part of Game Pass at the moment.
that's true.
So like, where is the cloud streaming coming from? And a lot of it,
I guess Nvidia also has their thing.
Yeah, Nvidia, and I guess PlayStation as well with PlayStation
But,
Plus.
like,
But on
again,
the
none of
majority
those-
PlayStation Plus subscribers, are they actually subscribing for that? I don't know that they are.
Yeah, and none of those are really like a serious competitor to Game Pass, right? I don't think there's a legitimate Game Pass competitor, and that's the problem. Is I don't think Microsoft is anywhere near having a monopoly in the games industry, but they certainly are close to having a monopoly in the cloud streaming space. Which, if it becomes important, obviously that's going to be a thing. But I guess that's the question, right? Is like how like valuable and ubiquitous does it need to be before it actually starts hurting the industry at large, right? And I think that's a big question. I think it's easy to see how it could fuck up PlayStation, right? Like,
And that seems to be the CMA's primary focus, right?
Yeah.
They don't see that because Nintendo doesn't have a play here in cloud streaming. It doesn't affect their business at all,
And it won't.
because their business is still selling consoles and games. But next generation, who knows? Maybe there is a streaming component to
Maybe.
to Switch Online
But
or whatever there is.
I think that's such a huge thing, though, right? Is like I don't see that, and that's a big part of why I don't see the industry moving away from it. Is like Nintendo is one of the market leaders almost every generation, and they're not doing that. Like, they're going to continue selling a piece of hardware that they designed with proprietary technology that plays games off cartridges or discs. That's what they're going to keep doing. That's unquestionable. Will they eventually move towards cloud when the technology becomes ubiquitous? Maybe, probably, but like, I mean, online gaming has been ubiquitous since the Xbox, and they haven't caught up on that, right? Like, there's a lot of things.
I mean, but they're safe, right? They're very conservative in the plays that they make, and they wait.
But think about this too, right? So there's that. PlayStation, fine. Argue that they're vulnerable, that losing these things affects their bottom line, that they could lose out to Microsoft and maybe eventually not exist anymore. Fine. That's a legitimate concern when you're talking about this. But then look at Steam. I don't think Steam's going anywhere. I don't think PC is going to switch to this
Me neither.
all streaming model.
And we know that Microsoft are going to put their games on PC anyway, because they have done. But they own that platform too, and that's the problem. Like, they own the main gaming platform. They own Windows,
they own Windows,
and that is the primary way that people play.
They
And
don't
on this
own
week's
the
episode of
primary
Steam
that people
podcast-
buy, though, and that's Steam.
No, they don't.
And that's my
Yes.
point, right? Is like, even if Microsoft became dominant and pushed PlayStation out of the market, it wouldn't mean that they just had a de facto lead in the video game market, right? Because there are a lot of different ways people play and a lot of different ways that people buy, and I think so much
PC
about the
gaming
way
is not
video
the
games.
majority, though, right?
No, it's definitely a smaller market, but it's also not insignificant, right? And like,
Mm-hmm.
I think for us to move to a place where cloud is like the de facto way people play, so much about the way that video games are bought, sold, and made would need to change. And that doesn't mean it won't, but I think it comes back to the same way that I felt moving into the PS4, Xbox One generation, where there was I remember hearing on IGN and GameSpot and all the big outlets at the time, this is going to be the last generation of consoles. After this, we're going to move to a unified platform, and we're not going to have PlayStation and Xbox. They'll have apps, and none of that came to pass, right? The last generation was the best-selling generation of consoles thus far, and this generation is on track to beat it, or at least keep pace.
Yeah, but we did not have in those generations a decent cloud streaming solution. I feel like both Microsoft and Sony are working on that at the moment, and I could easily see a time when, say, you buy a Sony TV and that has PlayStation on it, but it doesn't have Xbox.
Yeah, you're probably
and
right.
Then but they've got a partnership with Samsung, so if you bought a Samsung TV, you get Xbox, but you don't get PlayStation.
But I mean, think about it, man.
Maybe that decides like what TV you buy rather than what console you buy.
You're right. But again, that is a lot of ifs. You look back at the PlayStation 4 generation. You remember they had that big event where they revealed the PS4 and they talked about it for 2.5 hours, and it was like, here's what it is. Here's the architecture. Here's the games. It's for gamers, by gamers.
I listen to it regularly because Mark Cerny's voice just puts me to sleep. It's
Incredible
really
ASMR. He's the original ASMR artist. But think about it, right? what was one of the big things they hung their hat on during that presentation? We bought Gaikai, and we are going to figure out cloud streaming. And guess what? They
Yeah, and
didn't.
they fucked it up.
Right.
Like, big time.
And that's my whole point, though. We thought that those things were going to be ubiquitous, and they weren't, and they're not. And is Game Pass different? Absolutely. Right? I'm not sitting here saying that Game Pass is the same as Gaikai and PS Now and all that bullshit that didn't pan out. But the point is, right, like, where's the line for that, right? Because the reason that Game Pass has been able to be successful is because of how much money Microsoft was able to invest in it and be able to take losses on it for years before it became what it is. And I don't know that anyone else can match that. And if Microsoft is the only game in town that offers that, I don't think it's going to be...
Amazon could match it.
They could, as we've outlined before. But again, that's a big
and
if.
I actually think Apple could too, if they wanted to, if they really wanted to. Like, say they expand Apple Arcade and it becomes like a streaming platform, and they like, grow that out.
That's a huge if. That is a huge if. You're asking...
Netflix is also there as well. Like, Netflix is shaping up to kind of angle in on the games market.
I think Netflix is more likely to disappear entirely than they are to become a major player in the video games market. And you can quote me on that one. But that's the thing is, you're right. Any of those things could happen, but I think a lot of them are very unlikely to happen. I think Netflix being thought of the same way we think of Xbox is very unlikely. Amazon, Apple, you're right. They could, but they would need to have a company-wide agreement that video games are a necessary and vital part of the future of their business. And like, I don't know that that's going to happen. I don't know that Apple's, leadership is going to be like, yeah, this is what we should be doing. Like, let's double down on this.
No, the next play for them is VR and AR, and I don't think gaming really comes into it for them. Netflix, I could easily see disappearing because, companies with two CEOs at one time, co-CEOs, often do really, really well. Just look at BlackBerry. That panned out really well for them. But I think it becomes that you've got to adapt, you've got to evolve. Maybe Disney gets into the streaming business as well, because they're slowly building up their own arsenal of games with Marvel games and Lucasfilm games.
Yeah, but again, we read Jason's book. They got out of video games because they felt that like owning and maintaining studios was too risky a business.
It's a risk, yeah.
And now you look at the success of Marvel games and to a lesser extent Star Wars, right? Like, they're having a lot more success just licensing out their IP to other companies that can take on the risk, right? Because if the next Marvel game comes out and sucks, or even like Marvel Midnight Suns, which reviewed well but underperformed, well, guess who took the risk on that? 2K, right? Not Disney, not Marvel. Because they don't want to do that. They don't want to own a studio outright and operate it for 6 years and then have a game come out and underperform. They're not willing to do that. Whereas like companies where their bread and butter is video games, that's the business, man. Like, that's what you got to do. And that's why I think you don't have an example of many major companies entering gaming and sticking around. There's two examples in my knowledge, and it's Sony and it's Microsoft. And we know the reason why Sony entered this space, right? Like, that was not really intentional in the way that it was for Xbox, right? Xbox entered the space because they're like, our direct competitor entered this space and we need to match them, right? Sony did it, honestly, out of spite, right? They had an agreement with Nintendo. Nintendo backed out and embarrassed them.
Microsoft wasn't our direct competitor. They were worried that they'd lost out.
They lost the living room. That was the whole thing, right? We watched that documentary series they did on YouTube.
Yeah, I think it was Power On. Really good.
Really good.
Before we wrap up on this section, I wanna touch on stuff that Bobby Kotick said on interview over on CNBC. And he said the FTC, the CMA, and the EU don't know our industry, so they're trying to come up to speed to fully understand the industry better. And I would kind of agree with that.
Definitely agree.
Portion of the statement.
And again,
and then
Bobby
he said,
he's a bad person. I just think he makes sense on this point. That's all we're saying.
Then he goes on to say, I don't think they fully understand it's a free-to-play business, that the Japanese and Chinese companies dominate the industry, with Sony and Nintendo, who have these huge libraries of intellectual property. I think the regulators are a bit confused as to where the competition is today.
I think that's fair. right? Like, I mean, despite the fact that America is I think the biggest video game like market in terms of purchasers, the industry is dominated by Eastern companies, right? You have Sony and Nintendo as console holders, Tencent emerging as like a major player in the last couple years. Yeah, I mean, and like we've talked about, Xbox is a clear number 3.
Yeah, but I don't know why the CMA and the EU would care about that, because it's an American company buying another American company. I can understand the FTC might want to encourage, you know, in your country,
Right.
but the CMA and the EU are directly considering consumers in their countries. And I think the CMA directly called out the fact that Sony was the leader and was the market leader and was potentially the one that sought to lose the most
Mm-hmm.
if this acquisition went through. So I don't really know. I don't really know what kind of his argument was there against what the CMA said. Because I don't necessarily. Yes, maybe it's a free to play business, and that's what people are playing on mobile. But these platforms cost money, and that's what it's all about. It's about the cloud platform, and that's where the concerns are.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said, you know, there's definitely legitimate concern, you know, and I think like they're right to be cautious, because the reality is that like we don't know what the long-term effects of this stuff is going to be until it happens. And I understand wanting to be proactive and trying to protect consumers and trying to protect the health of an industry that provides a lot of jobs in countries like the UK, right? There are several developers in the UK. So I get it. To put a pin on this, the final ruling is going to be due on April 26th. That's going to be when we get kind of the final word here. The CMA has left the door open for a potential remedy in the form of like them making small concessions rather than divesting the business. Like we said, right, there's the 10-year deal and everything like that. The bottom line here is that like the CMA is pushing for a structural remedy, but Xbox has several weeks now to offer up counter solutions that they feel properly address their concerns about market competition. And that's going to be the big question, is by April 26th, we'll know, is Microsoft going to be able to make a strong enough argument that they can get this pushed through as is, or are they going to have to go back to the drawing board and make some concessions? My
thing is, are these concessions, which they've supposedly been working on and were due to submit to the EU and FTC before the EU and the FTC came back with their findings to try and alleviate some of their concerns, are they going to be able to, with the same concession across all of them? Like if the EU and the FTC find that it's in different areas, it's not cloud that they're concerned about, it's mobile that they're concerned about, or it's the console market as a whole that they're concerned about, that's potentially 3 different concessions you've got to make. And how do you do that and navigate 3 different entities that are all investigating?
You'd have to figure out
into this deal.
What's the concession you can make that is amenable to everybody, right? So you lose out on the least and can move forward with getting the biggest return. And I don't know. I think it's going to be complicated. That said, we focused a lot on the CMA because they're the the actor in this story right now. But I mean, when it comes to the FTC, like I know that there's been conversation that the FTC is looking to be more aggressive in what they're doing, and maybe they want to use this as an example to prove that, to put their money where their mouth is. But I gotta say, before we move on, that I think it would be hugely, hugely hypocritical for the FTC to say that this is problematic while they allowed Disney to acquire Fox.
But that was under a very, very different administration.
You're right, but I mean, historically, the FTC has not done a lot to avoid this kind of thing. We also have a duopoly in this country when it comes to internet, right? And that existed. That came, and I believe I'm correct that came to pass under a Democratic president, not a Republican. So it's like the FTC is largely toothless, in my opinion, when it comes to stopping monopolies, right? In the fucking where there was the threat in the late 90s, early aughts to break up Microsoft because they had a monopoly, and then they allowed Bill Gates to invest money in Apple to keep the only competitor they had in business. And it's like, is that really that? It's like, come on, right? Like they let shit like this slide all the time, and choosing this one example to plant your flag down and be like, enough is enough, feels, I mean, like I said, I'm not a fan of consolidation. If they want to make that a consistent viewpoint from here on out, great. But it feels motivated by folks that don't quite understand the video game industry when they just allowed this same thing to happen in the television and film industry and streaming industry.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think the Bethesda acquisition is only kind of gone against them as well.
Yeah.
Looking at the
It shows a
press release that
pattern.
they put out. Yeah, the release they put out on December 8th that says FTC seeks to block Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, and they specifically call out the record of acquiring and using valuable gaming content to suppress competition from gaming rivals, including its competition of ZeniMax, parent company of Bethesda Softworks, because they're not going to be making titles such as Starfield and Redfall available on other platforms. So, but I mean, to some extent, yes, you're right. They bought that company and they're making them exclusives, but Sony has bought countless studios and made them exclusive to their platform, and maybe it's like different because it wasn't such a big acquisition and such a big IP that they've
I
purchased.
think that's why, right?
It's
like
the same deal.
PlayStation has always acquired studios, right? Whereas Xbox has moved into acquiring publishers. And that's the thing, is that does reduce competition, right? Because now, rather than, you think about where the gaming industry was a couple years ago. If you had a big AAA game to shop around, right? You had options. You could go to Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo. You could go to Bethesda. You could go to Ubisoft. You could go to EA, right? And on and on and on, right? As you move down the list, you get to the smaller folks like Capcom and whomever, right? Square Enix. Now, Bethesda, ZeniMax, that's Xbox, right? So now those two publishers become one. And now Activision Blizzard, if that gets in there, that's 4 technically major publishers that are now all under one umbrella. And like, does that mean that less games get made or there's less opportunity? Not necessarily. But if it's a game that Xbox wants to pass on, that now means that 3 other places you could have gone are going to pass on it too, right? And maybe it's not even a matter of like passing, right? And being like, oh, now your game doesn't get made. But you have less options, right? You have less ability to go around and shop around and get a competitive deal and get a better rate. Like, those are things that hurt competition. Those are things that hurt the industry. And I think that's the bigger concern than, at least in my opinion, that's the bigger concern than them making a game exclusive. You know, I think making, Starfield exclusive to Xbox, like, does that hurt PlayStation gamers? Yeah, it does. But like, so did Sony acquiring Insomniac, right? And saying, okay, now they can't. They had just put out their first game on Xbox not that long ago before they were acquired, right? Now that competition is gone. They don't have access to them, and they're one of their most successful studios. So like, there's always going to be some level of that when it comes to acquiring studios. It's natural. But I think, like you said, like acquiring a publisher is different. Acquiring Elder Scrolls, Fallout, like these genre console-defining IP, and now being like, okay, now they're behind our walled fence, and you got to come buy our hardware, buy into our streaming platform if you want to have access to them. I mean, yeah, but like, they're doing that to try to increase competition. They're doing that to make themselves more attractive and more competitive in the market. And you got to draw the line somewhere with like, what is too big? Like, where is this not okay anymore? And, I think they've probably found it. I don't think they'll try another acquisition like this because it likely will not go through. But I don't know.
No, but who else is there left to acquire? Like, you can't buy anyone else, really.
I mean,
like Ubisoft.
Ubisoft is, like I think Ubisoft and Square are both eager to sell. I really do.
Yeah, I don't think Ubisoft is anywhere near the level of Activision.
No. But I don't think that these bodies would allow them to buy another big publisher like that if this goes through. No
way. And that also takes Ubisoft Plus out of the equation as well, which is another subscription service. And the FTC specifically called out subscription services, not streaming platforms. Right. They have concerns that this is not just streaming. And in the current market, they're right. It's not. You take out potentially a big, like, Activision Blizzard could make their own Game Pass competitor. They've already got subscriptions with World of Warcraft. If they lump those World of Warcraft subscriptions in with Game Pass, that's a huge player you've taken out of the equation. Same with like they could like have an Overwatch Plus or something like a Battle Pass, and you can have like bonuses for subscribing to Game Pass. There's a ton of things that they could look to do to make Game Pass more appealing to gamers, and potentially pass on, say, subscribing to PlayStation Plus for a month.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is certainly not the last time we're going to talk about this. At the very least, we'll talk about it again in April when this gets resolved. But definitely interested to hear from you folks at home. Is this something that you want to see go through? Are you concerned about market competition? How do you feel about it as a consumer? Because I think it's certainly an interesting question. But we've got some more to talk about, so we'll put a pin in that for today. Before we get into the question block, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of February. They are, of course, Anthony Gonzalez, Christian Oliveria, Christopher Valens, Earth Visitor, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Asobi, Mary Berry, Ty the Dude, Wakahula, and Zaid Ida. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. Y'all are the realest of the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows. So, let's jump in to the question block. We got the patented 3-question format from one Mr. Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Asobi, who wrote in over on the Discord and said, so, I thought I'd do something new as a one-off experiment with the rise in popularity of ChatGPT. Got a lot to say about that. The following patented 3-question format questions are nearly completely AI generated, although handpicked and slightly altered in wording by me. I have 20 questions that I generated with ChatGPT, but one of those is not AI generated and written by me. As a fun addition, try guessing which one that is. I'll put the answer down below as a spoiler. So, Steve, did you look? Do you know which question? You didn't cheat, did you?
I think I did when I copied it last week. It accidentally showed me, but I can't remember. Did it do the same for you today?
I didn't look at it. Like, when I pulled it in and, like...
I tried not to. I think I can remember, so I'll have to ask you the question.
Okay, so I'll guess, and you can abstain then.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll answer the questions first, and then we'll guess. So, number 1, is there a video game or video game moment that changed your view on something outside of video games? I think it's a good question.
It is a good question. I guess it's the same for media in general. I can't think of any specific moment, I don't think. But I think the games that stay with me, right? Like games that I think about a lot, I think do change your view and your values and things like that. Stuff like The Last of Us, for example.
Sure.
Like I think this it's kind of like just the meaning of the game, like what was the purpose of the story. I think story-driven games are more impactful like that.
Yeah,
I can
for
imagine
sure.
you probably had similar feelings with like God of War and things like that that provoke like emotions.
Yeah, so I think the part of the question that I'm stuck on is changing my view. I don't know that I've had a game change my viewpoint where I've had like a totally diametrically opposed view and then I played a game and was like, oh, I totally feel differently now. But I think that's probably because this probably sounds like I'm bragging, but I don't mean it that way. I think I'm generally an open-minded person, right? Like I'm not prejudiced, so there's not a lot of things I enter in with like hardline negative opinions that then would get changed through a narrative. That said, I can think of many games that have influenced the way that I think about things, right? And maybe not changed it, but like made me have a deeper understanding of it, if that makes sense. Like you brought up God of War. That game helped me solidify a thought I had about grief for a very long time, right? The way I think about grief and loss and the process of grieving, I think is different than a lot of people, right? Like, obviously, when you lose somebody, there's an intense amount of grief up front. But I really, part of my mentality is trying to... I'll say this. There's a quote from God of War Ragnarok that you may have seen making the rounds, right? And the quote is, to grieve deeply is to have loved fully, right? And, like, I think that's a really profound way of thinking. And it's something that, like, I come back to a lot. Whereas, like, like, this is a very personal example, but I had my childhood dog, whereas, like, my family dog that died when I, like, went off to college, and uh, whenever he comes up, like my dad will get very emotional about it, right? And it is like painful for him. But whereas for me, I still mourn his loss all the time. I think about him all the time, but I am overwhelmingly drawn to like focusing on the positive, right? And on
Yeah, me too.
the love that I felt, and that's why it hurts now, right? And like that's sad and that's hard, but that's part of being alive, right? And it's like you have to.
Yeah. I like that. And I kind of feel like I do the same thing. Like I've lost a lot of friends over the years, and at the beginning, you think about just the fact that they're not here anymore, and it's just that like that moment of just like, oh, that's sad. I'm never going to see them again, and eventually, it's just like you remember the happy times, and you're just like, oh, yeah, they used to like doing this, or they used to do that thing. Little things remind you of them every now and again, and
Yeah,
you just remember the happy moments, which is, I think, the right way to go about things.
for sure. And it's. I mean, there's no wrong way to grieve, right? I'll say that, but that's something I've tried to internalize, and I think not that the game made me feel that way for the first time, but it was like, oh, like this is a thing I feel, and it put it into words, and it helped me connect with those emotions in a way that I hadn't before, And I think Life is Strange and Life is Strange 2 both are similar for that for me. Tell Me Why as well, right? I think those are a lot of games that have helped me, again, right, not change my point of view, but I think evolve my point of view, because I have never been and will never be a young woman, a young person of color, a young queer person, right? But like being able to have those experiences where you play as a character that is very different from you and go through challenges that people who are actually of that background go through, and having a sense of like feeling those emotions in a way that you would never in your real life, right? I think is a really profound tool for extending empathy and being able to see yourself in people that are not like you and see them for their humanity, And again, not a thing I struggled with prior, but I think there's a scene in Life is Strange 2 where the character that you play as gets, confronted by these two racist guys that are threatening you, right? And you're put in a position where it's like, do you push back and risk being hurt, right? Or do you roll over and then feel that negativity of like not standing up, right? It's like that's a thing I've never experienced, right? But having that moment in the game, I think helped me understand it in a way that is closer to, reality than I had maybe thought of before, right? And I don't know, maybe this is a messy example and what I'm trying to say isn't coming across, but yeah, I think video games are a profound tool for helping you understand other people and other walks of life, and or things like that dragon cancer, right? Like I've never had cancer, but like you get a sense of what that struggle is in a way that I think helps connect with somebody else and be able to see
Well, like Hellblade, where you're playing someone with, I think she's got schizophrenia, right?
Sure, right. Yeah, and I think things like that can do a lot to help you, like.
I think it could make you a more empathetic person.
Yeah,
You can
absolutely.
understand like what they're going through,
or at least to want to try.
whereas necessarily you didn't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I think those are the examples that come to mind for me. Number 2, very relevant question for today. Actually, glad we hung on to this one for this week. Where do you see the gaming in 10 years? What do you think will change in a big way in the next 10 years?
So I think this one was not.
I guess this one was AI generated,
Sobi.
right? The grammar.
The gaming. Where do you see the gaming in 10 years?
Where do you see the gaming?
I see the gaming becoming. I think AI is going to play a role in it. We've already seen. I think the first game that was openly used AI was that one from Justin Roiland's studio. What was
High
that
on
called?
Life, yeah.
High on Life.
There was,
like
I think,
that.
some of the background art was generated with AI.
Yeah, they generated all of the background art that was around with AI, which was quite cool. I could see that stuff continuing, but I think the trend is going to be more towards subscription-based services, less focus on selling actual box copies of games. I think that's where people want it to go. It's where all other mediums have gone, movies and video games and TV shows. People don't buy them anymore. They just expect to have them and pay a fixed price every single month for it. And I think that is going to hopefully, and maybe this is a hope rather than where I think it's actually going to go, encourage experimentation a bit more, because I don't think we would have got something like Hi-Fi Rush if Game Pass didn't exist, because it's it's very divergent from their previous games, like the Evil Within. It's nothing like that. It's nothing like Ghostwire Tokyo, but it's possible. Same with Pentiment. It's possible to make those kind of games because there's less of a risk, because you know there is always going to be some revenue coming in from those games, and I think that's what they care about. And I think hopefully it means, I also think we're going to get fewer AAA titles in the same way we have before, because they just take longer to make. People have higher expectations for them. They're more expensive to make. So making these smaller games in between that are seen as a little bit riskier but can be offset with the price of a subscription is probably where it goes in the next 10 years.
I definitely agree on that latter point. I think broadly we're probably, and I don't know that this will track for the entirety of the 10-year period that we're discussing, but I think for the rest of this generation at least, I think we're going to see a lot less AAA releases. You know, we talked about this, I think on last week's show, right? We were talking about Naughty Dog and their output in the PS3 generation versus the PS4 generation versus what it feels like their output is going to be this generation. And you see a consistent decline, right? Because I think we're moving into a space where, yeah, like the cost associated and the time required to make a AAA game that meets people's, you know, quote unquote next gen expectations is only going to take longer and longer, which I actually think is a good thing. I think we hit a period last generation where like there was just too many games coming out, and I think like having big tentpole releases spaced out a little bit more and leaving more room for, you know, not just the indies and the, you know, the double A's and the smaller experiences to kind of rise to the top. It also gives games a chance to have a longer shelf life. You know, I think you look at a game like I brought up earlier, Marvel Midnight Suns, which reviewed really well, but kind of failed to meet sales expectations. But 2K has positivity that they think it'll have a long tail in the way that like other games from Firaxis have.
Yeah, every Firaxis game is the same. Like people still buy Civilization 6 now because they just, you know, never got around to picking it up.
Too,
they love those
right?
games.
Like, constantly goes on sale, and like I'm sure people are picking it up all the time. So I think that that's actually healthy. I think the fact that like games are hopefully going to take longer, you know, rely less on crunch and give them more space to breathe, I think is actually good for the health of the industry and like IP in general. Because I think there are a lot of great games that come out and fail to find an audience and then just kind of go away, you know, or you know, or like they don't get that sequel, they don't get that next at bat, just because there isn't as much opportunity for them to be discovered. And I think having these kinds of services like Game Pass and stuff like that, I think of like a franchise like Deus Ex Machina, which was something that like reviewed really well for years, but just never really found the audience it needed to survive in the increasingly competitive, expensive AAA space. And I like the idea that games can like they don't need to be blockbusters to survive if there is this more forgiving model. I hope that that's true. You know, I think it might be wishful thinking in many ways, but I hope that you're correct. And I think some of the examples you gave are good ones. I don't know that a game like Pentiment gets made if Obsidian isn't acquired by Xbox, right? So like maybe that's true. Maybe that is something we can hang our hat on. In terms of like what will change in a big way, I actually don't think that much. I think that I made this point earlier. I think people prognosticate about big changes in the gaming industry and they rarely come to pass. And I think the fact that we are currently, you know, entering or already in the throes of, depending on what country you live in, a global recession. I think that it's going to make companies more risk averse. I think it's going to make taking risks, like big risks, something that companies are not willing to do. And I think that as a result, it's going to make it so that things just don't change that much, right? I think the PlayStation 5 model is the same model as it was the year before, and it's the same business model from the 3 generations prior to that, right? And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I think Xbox and Microsoft are really the only big player that can continue to make crazy risks because that's what they've pinned their business model on. And like, let's be real, they are an arm of one of the most successful companies in the world, right? Like, they don't have the same risk that Nintendo or Sony do if business turns right away, So I think the trends that we've seen begin, right? Like the push towards cloud and those things, I think Xbox will continue walking that path. I think it'll continue to evolve and become a relevant segment of the market, more so than it is right now. But I think by and large, I think the other big players in the space are not going to change what they're doing much because they're going to be afraid to.
I could see some. I could really see Valve making more of a play for like the mainstream consumer rather than just being like a niche PC player.
Maybe.
In the same way that they've done with the Steam Deck, and I think one of my predictions was that they launch a subscription service this year. I think that could still happen. I think there's a lot that could change in the PC space because I think at the moment that's not capitalized on as much as it could be. That's very much an enthusiast place to play video games, and I think there is some room there for Valve to be in the mix in the conversation in the next 10 years with the likes of Sony and Microsoft and Nintendo when we talk about the big platforms.
I think you're probably right that there's a good chance that happens. I guess we'll see, right? Like they've been doing very interesting, different things the last year and change. So, I think they see that the landscape is changing and they want to stay competitive. I think,
and of course, you've said multiple times that VR is the future. That's what everyone's gonna do. They're just gonna strap these things on their face, and we're all just gonna be walking around with those.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, I think there's two things I'm really not happy about that I think will happen though, and I think that is going to be continued consolidation. I think the middle-sized publishers of the world are almost all going to consolidate or disappear.
They're pretty much all gone anyway, right? It's like you've got some in Japan, but
you still have a bunch, right?
In the West, there's no like.
It's less than it used to be.
Mid-sized.
But I mean, you got
Ubisoft's the only potential mid-size at this point.
Capcom, Sega.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They're all in Japan. In the West, they're all gone.
Oh, I gotcha. Well, I mean, Devolver and
they're all gone.
Annapurna.
Devolver's a publicly traded company.
Yeah.
So like all of the private small
That's
publishers. True. They're gone.
Yeah.
All gone.
And I think that's the thing, right? I think that's going to continue. I think like the middle and smaller size publishers are going to either consolidate, right? Like I could see like Annapurna and Devolver becoming one company, or I could see, Capcom and Sega becoming Capcom Sega, right? Like things like that. So the smaller, more vulnerable companies can beef up and come together and try to stay profitable. Or I think they're going to sell, and that, and maybe that's Amazon comes along and snaps a couple of them up. Maybe that's, PlayStation or Embracer or Tencent or whatever. But I don't see a lot of those companies staying independent for much longer. And I think that will probably likely even push your theory further forward, where there will be less AAA games because there'll be less people to publish them.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I think there's going to be way less AAA games, and I think we just have to accept that fact. We may get like one game from Sony this year and like one game next year.
Which, I mean, again, right? We talked about that last week. That's not actually that abnormal, but.
No, yeah, I know, but people think it is, and people want more and more and more and more. But you get one game from Sony, one game from Ubisoft, one game from EA. I could easily see stuff like that happening.
I think that's where we're probably moving, yeah. And then I think the other thing, like I said, the risk averseness, I think, is going to kill enthusiast markets. Like VR. I think there's a real good chance that VR is heading towards being dead. And not forever, not totally, not that no one will invest in VR, but we talked a lot about how we think PSVR is not going to succeed, right? And I don't think that that's limited to PlayStation VR. When people are strapped for cash, it's the risky, weird shit that doesn't make the cut. Last question of the day. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the gaming industry today, and how should they be addressed?
Media consolidation, and I also think talent shortage is a huge one.
I think it's those two, and I think it's a global recession, right? I think it's those three things. It's that There's a talent drain right now, and like games are a luxury thing, and like the return is good.
The problem is like, why would you? The problem is they're just not paying people enough.
No.
For the amount that these games make, and that is the way you solve that problem. Because why would you go and crunch and work on a video game at a studio where you treat like absolute shit, when you can go work in Silicon Valley, probably remotely these days, and earn a lot more?
And also be treated.
And it's a lot easier. Yeah, but nowhere near as much as making a video game.
Well, that's the thing, right?
You don't crunch as much.
It's the same thing you see in caring industries, though, right? Caring industries and artistic industries, they do this to people because it's somebody's dream to work on video games, right? It's millions of people's dream to make video games, to make art. And people will eat a lot of shit to do that. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a big problem. I think obviously we're both pro unionization in the industry. I think there's a big culture problem and a big employment problem. And yeah, I mean, it's like I think the industry it's heading for the most precarious position it's been in years. I think the games industry has been extremely healthy for a long time, and it's been consistently growing. And I think between the pandemic lockdown era having artificially inflated profits, and that's going away, we're going to see more layoffs. We're going to see more canceled projects. We're going to see more consolidation as these companies are trying to like batten down the hatches and weather the storm. And I think a lot of them are probably not going to survive, or are going to look a lot different on the other side of it. And that's unfortunate. But I mean, you got to just hope that the vibrancy of the indie space is enough to stay alive, and that these small companies can stay profitable, even though, stuff is getting harder. It's getting tougher and tougher to run a small business. And that, I think, is the biggest risk for the health of the industry, is getting to the point where the yacht clubs, the healthy independent studio publishers that have carved out a successful business model for themselves, if they can't survive, that's when the industry is going to move into a really dire place. And we'll be looking at a Hollywood situation. Okay, so I'm going to guess that number 2 is definitely an AI question.
The gaming.
Because of the gaming. I think number 1 is Asobi's question. Because I don't think...
Why?
Because I don't think an AI... So in his question, or in number 1, video game is one word. Capital V, lowercase g, one word. I don't think it would spit it out that way. So that's my first reason.
Yeah.
And then number 2, oh no, I don't know though, actually, because now I'm thinking number 3, it feels like the language is a little repetitive. So I'm like, oh, that might be AI generated. But video game is in the first question 3 times. So that's very repetitive. So I was like, is that?
Yeah.
I'm going to say it's number 1 because of the spelling thing. I think the spelling thing is the red flag.
Okay. And I want to know if Asobi purposefully did this, because number 1 is correct. It was
Bam!
Asobi.
Yeah, I wonder if he did that.
I would have guessed number 1 for the exact same reason, because AI would, I think, have spelt video game into 2. But I'm also curious as to whether ChatGPT didn't do it as that, like, what,
and then Asobi left it in,
he generated,
yeah,
and so he like copied it in and like did another question, but did like that as like a red herring for us to do it. Because in the same way that it said the gaming with a capital G in gaming, like, video game could have easily been the same, right? Whereas
yeah, that's true.
The last one,
gaming was
like, it could have been a red herring they put in there. So
yeah.
I think it's sneaky. He's a sneaky fella.
Yeah, for sure. We'll talk about that another day, I guess. That's a broader conversation, of which I have many opinions.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about AI a little bit, because obviously Microsoft as a whole has gone all in on it, and I'm interested to see if they go down that route with gaming as well.
We shall see. So, thank you guys for tuning in for another episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. Remember, if you want to write into the question block like Asobi did, you want to write in with your thoughts about what's going on across the pond with Microsoft and the Activision Blizzard acquisition, please write into the show. There's a bunch of ways you can get involved. Head over to flipscreen.games, our website. You can write into us questions at flipscreen.games via email. You can come join our Discord where the conversation keeps rolling between episodes. However you choose to get involved, we greatly appreciate you tuning in for this week's show. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. Keep on gaming.